Hey everyone, I'm Adam Orth, studio head of Digital Eclipse Los Angeles, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today I'm going to be speaking with John Johanas, the director of Hi-Fi Rush, and we're going to be talking about the creative spark that sent him down the path of game design, building trust with his boss and mentor Shinji Mikami, his background and journey through music that led to Hi-Fi Rush, and what's next for the franchise. Hope you enjoy it.
You looking for me?
Get him!
Mind if I join?
Does that mean I have to fight?
I believe it does, sir. How about...
This is entertaining.
Here's your Project Armstrong pass. And welcome to Vandalay Campus.
Yes!
Hey John, how's it going?
Good. I'm glad to be here. I'm a huge fan of this podcast, which I guess now is video oriented, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I'm
Is this the
also
first
a
one?
huge.
I don't know. If it's video. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm. This is my first time hosting, so I'm excited to be here and to talk to you. I've learned a lot about you over the past week,
That
and
sounds
I've
ominous.
really
But
been.
yeah.
No, it's all good. And I've been really enjoying playing Hi-Fi Rush. I have not finished it, but that's definitely going to happen.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool.
It's an amazing game, and I have a lot of questions to ask you about it. So what I wanted to do was start off and ask you how you got started as someone who ended up where you are in video games. What was was there a creative spark or a seed in your childhood that kind of set you off on this path? How did you get here?
I like to think a lot of it was just by chance, realistically. I mean, I grew up playing video games, like most of us in the industry have. And I enjoyed playing them by myself. I enjoyed playing them with my friends, but I really never saw myself as someone who wanted to make games or would eventually make games. I just didn't see that as a career path. Maybe, I don't know. I didn't know how it was done or what was involved, but I just know I didn't have the training per se. But my journey through education took me to Japan, and I was doing my own sort of self-study as I was doing some other work, which involved like translating and things like that, just for fun actually. And I sort of stumbled on a website for Tango Gameworks, which is now Tango Gameworks, but before was just an unnamed studio. At that point, Shinji Mikami had opened a studio called the Shinji Mikami Project, and kind of put out a post for people he wanted in the studio, and it was kind of in my news feed because I follow games, just as a gamer. And what was interesting was all the qualifications. There was nothing specific about it. It was just like likes games, wants to make games, enjoys games, has a passion for games, like things like these very, just sort of, plain, fan of game-esque qualifications. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't have any sort of training or background, or I didn't do any self-study or look into making games, but, I just kind of sent a cover letter to this studio saying, I had done some translating and things like that. And this was an era, this is when, this was like 2010 or something like that. And it's kind of like the PS3 generation when maybe Japan was a little bit struggling with their games being being well recepted in the United States and things like that because of being too Japanese. I think there was this kind of weird time. They were a little bit like struggling to find their footing. And I always liked those games regardless. So I was like, I want to help make whatever you do just not feel like that, make it more approachable to a worldwide audience. And I kind of did an interview and I don't know what happened, but, I was brought on board essentially to help out in a small studio, which at that point was about 20 people. And it was a small studio. So therefore everyone was sitting next to each other. And when they were talking about game ideas, I was just right there and I was just kind of casually and, sometimes annoyingly, just kind of leaning over and being like, that sounds terrible.
But soaking it all in though.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of interesting because our company or our studio doesn't really, it's not like we have like a training program, and I don't think, especially from my boss's background, I don't think Capcom did either. I think it was kind of like learn trial by fire type situation where we're going to put you in with a group of people who know what they're doing. You're going to watch them. They're going to give you orders and you're going to kind of figure it out. When you're going to mess up, you're going to learn and then you're going to do it. And so I just kind of kept, butting my head in all these game design meetings. And, I was taken aside being like, do you just want to join the game design team? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And so that's how I got involved in Japan, we call it kikaku, which is just a general sort of game designer term. I know now it's become much more defined, if you're a game designer, you're a level designer, you're a systems designer, or something like that. But, it's a very sort of generalist term and which would encompass things like level design and story or just gameplay concepts. And you would pitch things.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I got into the industry kind of in a similar way. And when I was first coming up through design and learning about all that kind of like you're describing, like through osmosis, I started in QA and moved out into game design. There weren't really many titles back then. I started, it was just kind of general design and you kind of were learning and doing everything. Like you were just as responsible for the level design as you were the systems design. And I felt like that really gave me a leg up in terms of design chops, for what I was doing. And I'm curious if you can look back on that now and see where you are today and see a connection of kind of having to be scrappy about it and where it's led you.
Yeah, I do feel like, kind of figuring stuff out on your own. I could see it being difficult for some people who need that sort of guidance. But I was the type of person, at least at that point in my life, where I was kind of looking for any bits of information and trying to do it myself. Like I said, I had no experience using any sort of like engine or things like that. And one of the first, we were working on The Evil Within, which I was a game designer, which also meant that I was doing level design and I was doing some like story elements and designing puzzles. And the way it was done is you were sort of essentially a director on this stage that you were being put in charge of. And that's how it was done. Instead of kind of you're in charge of the how the guns work, or you're in charge of how like the enemies work. It's kind of like you're in charge of this sort of mini game within this bigger game. And so it made you talk to, for example, each department, and you figure out what everyone's doing, what they need from you as a game designer, what you need to them, and how to ask for it, and also when you're sort of overstepping your boundaries, or you're going too crazy and you're taking resources away from other teams and things like that. And again, this is, another like trial by fire. You do thing that you think you're confident in, and then you get blowback from other teams, or what's often happens in development is that the scope of the project changes, or something in the project changes. So now all that stuff you worked for is now essentially useless and you can't be used. They have to redo it. And it's
Been there many times.
Yeah. And it kind of teaches you a lot of things about, that people say it. It's like, never get too attached to ideas. You have to really make sure it works in the whole of the game. See people's reaction. You think it's great, but everyone else is saying it's bad, and that's not ideal. And yeah, I think that being in a situation like that, for example, if I was just in charge of one system, I feel like it's easy to get sort of pigeonholed into that type of work and not really understand. And that's just not to say that I do understand all about programming, but I have a better understanding of probably what the programmers would need to do their job based off the skills that I learned, for example, even on the first project. And it's, grown incrementally on projects afterwards as well.
Do you think that's an effect of maybe cultural difference between how games are made in Japan and maybe how games are made in America?
Interesting is that I've never worked in America, so I don't even know how games are made in America. Right. It's kind of funny. Yeah. And I constantly get called out at work by being the most Japanese person in the studio in terms of like, kind of like maybe like old school, like devotion to a craft, or, going over like the finer details and things like that. I don't know why.
I do think it's interesting because I think up until, I mean, maybe after like 2010 or so, it seemed like there was a real change in game development. This is just my observation. I have no data to back this up or any proof that anything I'm saying is worth listening to. But I really felt like the discipline of game design really started becoming compartmentalized into these are specific types of game designers. They always existed, and to some extent, they've always kind of been part of the fabric of the design discipline, at least, from making games here in America. But I do feel like designers that maybe came before a certain time have a different outlook on the discipline, because you really had to jump in, like you described, like, okay, one day it's pickups and the next day it's like level design. And, you really had to do that. And I also had the experience of having to like understand the approach and needs from a design standpoint per discipline, like you did. And that started for me in QA and went into design. And I found that really helpful, even still today, because it really taught me about the importance of not only how design goes out into the other disciplines of a development team, but how those also come in. And, I think I always advocate to young designers to, do as much as you can outside of your kind of chosen lane, and maybe not even choose a lane, because, the more you end up doing on a team, the better you're going to be, at your chosen craft.
Yeah, I would agree as well. And I think to what you said before about, the jobs being more compartmentalized, is I just think of a result of games just being so complicated these days that realistically, you had games where you could oversee everything or be in charge of or wear multiple hats. But now, you can have someone spend 5 years just working on, one single aspect of a complex, system-based game or something like that. But I think going back to what our kind of studio was founded on is that that we wanted, people to have, it's this form of like ownership over the things that they make. And that includes not just your job per se, but you're part of a team that's working on something. So, I mean, I don't want to like sort of, we're not putting down these type of games, but we would use, I think that was when you saw games like, especially huge open world games. I think one of the big things was like, we watched a demonstration about like Assassin's Creed, one of the upcoming Assassin's Creed. And it was like I think it was like a GDC presentation or something like that. And someone was talking about how, there was like an artist dedicated to just making the light poles in the game. And we're seeing that, and it almost
Or the guy
felt
who,
like,
the guy who was in charge of Batman's cape, right?
yeah. And it almost felt a little bit, and again, this is not putting down their work, but a little bit sad that, you can have someone wasn't previously in charge of like, I made this whole chunk of the game. I do remember when we were talking to id early on, like we joined Bethesda, and id was one of the studios who were sharing their technology with us. And one of the environment artists came over to demonstrate sort of the id tech engine. And he was like, oh, I made the environment for Doom 3. And I was like, oh, which parts? He's like, oh, the whole game. I did everything. It was just me. And,
Wow.
that sense of like, I put everything in there. I'm responsible for every aspect. And that's, contributing to like what the experience is. And I think the smaller your part is, you feel less maybe engaged in some other elements of the game. It's like, if it is, you're just working on Batman's cape, it's like, you don't feel involved in the combat aspect of the game. So then you feel, I'm not responsible for that. That's not my thing. And maybe those people don't feel that way, but I can see that it drifting towards that element. So,
yeah. And when you're a leader on a design team, I've been in the situation where you have those people who are focused on one specific, very important thing. And there's some people who are totally up for that and they're totally focused, and that's great for them. But there's other people who clearly want to expand past that important thing that they're tasked with on the team. And that can get real dicey because, there's a need for what you're supposed to be doing. And there's nothing wrong with ambition, but that can't outweigh your contribution to the team. And I think that I just think there's a lot of like really intricate dances around the compartmentalized nature of any discipline, really. And you see that in everything other than design as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's, why I'm weirdly thankful that I joined this studio at that specific moment in time, because I got to, be in an environment where you did get to experience sort of all aspects of things. And it helped me feel more confident in pitching, if it was, for example, like the first project I was in charge of was the DLC for the first game. It's like, I felt like at that point, I felt like an understanding of, what would a whole experience, entail, that I could pitch it and be confident in scoping it. And then again, project after project, doing that, but also I wanted to make sure that the projects that we work on, that the staff also felt like that, like they had ownership, and they weren't just in charge of these smaller details, that they had these big chunks of the game that when the game was released or something, saying, not that I made that light post, it's like I made that entire level, or I made that entire section of the game. So that whole experience of seeing something from start to finish from a broader game design perspective can then either help out people in the future or help their career and help makes the next project even better because they have a better way to approach the next thing that they're assigned.
Yep, totally agree with that. So was that DLC for The Evil Within?
Yeah, the first Evil Within. We were working as we were kind of finishing up developing on that. We knew that we were doing, at that point, it was very common to have that sort of season pass DLC model, and as we were making that game, we knew that there was sort of these story plot hole type things, especially when you're on the development end. You can see them. The user may not see them, but as you're developing them, you see kind of these holes in the game design or the world design. And so I pitched an idea saying, okay, if we do a story DLC, can it be this? Like, not with the intention of I want to be the director of this project. It's like, I have an idea. Can I pitch it to you? To not only make a good experience, but also make the greater experience of what the original game was, make it feel more complete. So if users do see these sort of holes that we unfortunately have in the original project, it makes it seem like we were aware it was all planned or something. So I put up this whole document about this story-based DLC, and this is the gameplay aspects, and it was kind of this whole full pitch about everything. And I sort of got the very casual, like, go ahead. And it's like, yeah, sure. And you seem to have a story in mind, so why don't you just kind of like write up a script? I was like, okay, So I did that, and I wrote this script, and I was kind of then pitching it to the team because I wrote the original document. And then I was told, you pitched it, you wrote the script. Why don't you just be in charge of sort of directing this piece of content? And that was.
So did you have to get the go ahead to get it paid for? Was it planned, or is this really like, I truly believe in this thing, let's go for it, and then you had to kind of get it greenlit?
This is me not really understanding the monetary value of a greenlight process, right? So
right.
For me, getting it greenlit was going to my boss, Mikami-san, and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. And him saying, this is cool, let's do it. And I don't know what he did in the background, but
right.
But we kind of agreed that we were making DLC for the game. So it's like, okay, we're going to make something anyway. That was planned. So let's do this. And I'm kind of thankful for that, because I think he was, sort of watching out to make sure that maybe the first thing as a designer, you do have to be wary about scope and budget and what to do. But that kind of first sort of foray into, full on large scale design, you kind of want to not feel like stressed by the budget constraints. You want to feel like, oh, I'm being very creative, and then figure out later like where to back down on. So if you're worried from the beginning about budget, you're immediately like sort of limiting yourself. But you do need to think about that. So I think it was a good sort of system where I was like sort of weirdly sort of guarded by that information on purpose. So I didn't feel like stunted in making it as interesting as possible.
That's probably a really good example of leadership and allowing something to grow.
Yeah, but also maybe irresponsible as well, because something could
but
easily go out of scope. And
you don't, when you see people who have the spark, you have to give them the opportunity. And however that manifests itself, you gotta kind of go for it sometimes. Obviously he believed in you, and it turned out that was the right thing.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm very thankful for that experience. And luckily it's kind of, I would say it's actually much harder to get that experience now, because like I said, of the scope of some titles, like it was in a weird time where, it
must be really like, not must be, it is. It's like nobody's making bets like that really anymore at the AAA scale. Like there has to be like proven success, because so much is riding on every single decision these days.
Yeah. And and that, that sort of smaller content, granted games still do that sort of like DLC content, but even now, like the scope of those things are sometimes gigantic. Or they're not in the sense where you feel like you're crafting like you're like a smaller game within a game. It's, I mean, there are some examples, but I think you need that. You can't, it's hard for someone who doesn't have the experience to immediately jump in and say, I'm going to, even if they were given the go ahead by a higher up, someone who just has, for example, regular game design experience, to immediately go, I'm going to develop this hundreds of millions of dollar AAA game or something like that. Like,
Right.
but then it becomes kind of like a vicious cycle where the only people being put in charge of that are the people who have experience, and the people below them don't have the chances to learn that. And that's also kind of why this studio that I'm a part of was founded, to give people that experience, because I think, at that point, Mikami-san had a vision of that games. It was headed in that direction. Like, it was getting harder and harder to give someone the reins on a large project because they couldn't do it. And small projects were getting harder and harder to, fit in that sense. Right. Because it was like getting bigger. The scale was getting bigger.
Was that
yeah.
Sorry. I was gonna say, was that a natural bridge to directing the second game?
For me, yes, because I mean, I was told like I did a good job on directing those projects. They were received well as well. So, I guess, and because of that, there was like a better sort of camaraderie sense in the team. And this is also something that's very hard to explain, but it's hard for a lot of people to trust a person with like a singular vision without results, or without sort of something to go off of. So when we're talking about, for example, being in a position like that, having the example of working on it was a 2-part DLC, so 2 separate projects essentially, and both being received relatively well, and development being for the most part enjoyable, contributed, I think, to the next project, them having a bit more confidence in, okay, if this person says this is what direction that we're going in, I'm confident that will probably work out. And granted, there was only 2 projects, but I was always told that back in the day, projects, for example, in the early Super Nintendo days or the PlayStation days, you'd have like a year and a half. So within the scope of a normal game development timeline now, which is about, could be up to like 4 years, 5 years, you could put out 3-4 titles. And the common theme that I was told was that you need about 3 titles until your team starts trusting you, which in today's game development terms means 15 years of working with the same people until they'll both trust you. So it's extremely, it's getting harder and harder, I think, to do this type of work. And it's like the pool is getting smaller in a sense. But again, I don't know, for example, how other studios do it, or especially how smaller studios do it. But it did, like I said, it was a kind of an incremental thing. So I was able to achieve that with these 2 small titles, going into a larger title that was, even with that experience, was extremely, extremely difficult. I would say that was the most difficult project I worked on by far, even compared to how technically and design-wise challenging Hi-Fi Rush was. Probably The Evil Within 2 is the most difficult from like a personal perspective of the scope of things, and having, even more people to manage, and having the sort of weight of, it being a sequel to a game that needs to deliver on certain, check boxes in terms of, a high profile game, and a sequel to an IP that you're not in charge of, you don't have full control over. And that was extremely challenging.
So let's talk about something you just said about like the personal weight of that on that project, and how how did you face that challenge, you know, just to get through the day and keep your team, confident in your vision for what you were making?
It's weird. Honestly, I don't even know how I did in a sense that it was like kind of like that stressful. Um, yeah, it was one of those things where like you had to like kind of psych yourself up to go to work in the morning type of level, because you're getting in front of a lot of people. When something's not going well, it's affecting a lot of people. It's affecting like 50 people, 60 people, and you have to make decisions. Like a good example is, that game was known for having this sort of pseudo sort of open world map, which went back to, that was an original concept that we wanted to do for the first game, but we didn't kind of have the technology or understanding of the mechanics in order to pull that off. But it was kind of, hey, let's do it. If we're going to do it, let's do it now type thing. As well as a lot of like poor decisions on our part of things like, hey, let's redo all the animations for the main character to make them better. Let's incorporate a whole new lighting system. And at the time you're thinking, yeah, this is great. It's the second one. We're going to make all this stuff. It's going to be better, bigger, better. And you kind of then realize, managing all these things is very difficult. But like things like, we made this big map and then we realized this is way too big. We don't have enough people to sort of support this. And then, people had worked on these sections for a long time and you're like, okay, we're just going to cut up this map. We're going to just get rid of all this stuff. I'm sorry you worked on it for a very long time, but we don't have time to do this, and kind of make these like hard lines in the sand. People then get upset at you. Why didn't you tell me that sooner? It's kind of like this thing that all directors experience, but when the scale is so big in that, then the feedback is also very big.
Yeah. I can remember being a designer and working for like 6 months on a map that like I had historically researched, and it was kind of very true to what was happening, and an executive casually walking by my desk and stopping by to play it and put the controller down after, I don't know, 10 minutes. And he's like, make it a night mission, which is like, like
that's redoing everything. That's like,
it was a total
Yeah.
redo. And then I redid it and then it got cut. So, like those, I don't actually count my experience there as, a director making a decision for the good of the game. But I did want to highlight how you have those decisions, those decisions have to be so carefully weighed by the person who's making those decisions that, a flippant offhand remark like make it a night mission is, the dramatic ripple effects that has on a team and a game and just everything there is really damaging. So I've personally felt the pressure in creative director positions that I've been in to never ever do anything like that, because I learned that lesson firsthand where, I saw the impact of a poor decision making that wasn't thought through. And I can really identify with what you're saying about psyching yourself up in the morning to go to work, because that's a lot of pressure, right? It's a lot of pressure to lead a creative vision or a team or an effort, no matter what it is, even if it's just a small pod working on a feature or something. Like, it's like having that ability to see 5-10 steps down the road is critical for someone in your position. And again, I think that probably goes back to having been thrown in the deep end and having to learn all those things just by jumping in and figuring it out and having that experience. So I really relate to what you were saying.
Yeah, I think, the thing about, game development is, I still think no matter how much experience you have, it's not a science. Like there's no correct formula to make a game.
Absolutely
No
not.
matter how much you study, I've seen, for example, my boss, Mikami-san, like make decisions that didn't work out, and he had to apologize and say, "Yep, I thought it would go this way. I'm sorry. We're gonna redo it." But I think it was very important to what I learned as someone who also had their stuff cut, many times when a project shifted, is you want to understand, was the reason because of you, or was it because of an unfortunate result of something else? And then what is the result of this? And so I try to always make it feel like it's a personal thing for myself as well. Like, I'm cutting this. The reason we're cutting this is because of this, or the reason we have to change this is because of this. This will make the game better. And there is some aspect of yourself, I think, in the product that you're putting out. It has to be something that you think is interesting. I don't think there are games that are probably made like to spec, like someone wants a game that's like this, I'm making it to that specification. But I think we were a studio that's made to make these projects that do feel personal to us. So you have to say, I'm confident in this project as a person directing it, but but there's also like a legitimate reason why this has to be cut, and I have to,
Right.
and I always feel responsible to explain that and make that clear. And sometimes it isn't clear to that person. Sometimes they don't accept that answer. But and then sometimes you have to say, well, I'm sorry, but I know I understand how you feel, but I'm making the decision here, and that's why I'm doing it.
Those are the toughest parts about being a leader, for sure. You've got some experience under your belt. You go through the DLC for the first game, you direct the second game. I'm a little unclear, so excuse me if I don't have this right, but my understanding is that Ghostwire and Hi-Fi Rush kind of started at the same time, and you didn't work on Ghostwire.
So Ghostwire was sort of already in that sort of pre-production phase while actually Evil Within 2 was going on. So
Got it.
So when we finished up Evil Within 2, we knew that was next in line. Like
Okay.
that was the next game that was
all
made.
right.
Yeah.
Because I really want to transition to talking about Hi-Fi Rush, and I do want to ask you a couple questions before we kind of jump in. So, I understand you have a music background. I think I see a Starcaster behind you.
Yes, it is
Maybe?
a Starcaster.
Yes.
It's kind of
I have like 6 guitars over here that you can't see. I actually got into games through a professional music career, but that's another different podcast. Tell me just a little bit about the importance of music to you, so we can kind of have that thread going into Hi-Fi.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, I really don't know anyone who music hasn't been a part of their life in some part. But for me, I've just always been not just listening, but playing music. When you're in elementary school, they kind of force you to learn an instrument. At least, I don't know if you had that experience, but at least me growing up, and I played the alto saxophone, and I played it in our school symphonic band, and we had actually a jazz band. It was kind of this cool thing that we did it like at night. It was official. It wasn't like a sort of scrappy type thing. And it was kind of my first foray into like not as extreme as the movie Whiplash, but that type of vibe where our conductor was very sort of, he's going to give you harsh criticisms and things like that, and cut you off and yell at you if you're like a couple seconds late type thing. It was kind of that again, like this weird sort of like trial by fire, but like not as extreme as that movie. So I'm not saying we were like harassed or anything like that. But anyway, so I just enjoyed playing different types of music, and obviously, as I listen to music, as you play saxophone, there's not too many things that you can learn or play along with when you listen to rock music, unless you're really into like a ska band or something, maybe. But I always wanted to learn how to play guitar, and I just could never grasp how to do it. But when I joined our school jazz band, we had a bass player, and that's my first kind of encounter of seeing someone play the bass, of playing like these these sort of like just standard sort of incremental bass lines, and to go with the jazz chord, it's just like playing the roots and or doing a walking bass line or things like that. And I was like, that looks like something that I can do. Like, the guitar is too complicated, 6 strings. It's like 4 strings, I could do this. And so I started to learn the bass guitar, and I was learning kind of like all the the theory behind it, and just like in general how to play it. And then I started playing to like my my bands that I like or songs that I like, and try to figure out bass parts. And it was only
what were those bands?
It's like, this was late 90s, early 2000s. So it's kind of this stuff that is almost in the game. There's like obviously some like Nine Inch Nails stuff, but at the same time, it's the sort of stuff that people almost say is embarrassing now, but I still find it comforting. It's like that sort of like new metal scene and things like that. Like, if it's like
there's no
I'm still
embarrassing
a fan of, like,
music.
Oh, there isn't. Yeah, I think that's very important. Is that it's important to everyone, but I really like, for example, like Incubus. Like, I was like super into them. But they also did a very good job with, I think, I look back at, I'm glad I like that band, because when you actually break apart what they were playing, they were into playing like things that were more melodic rather than just like harsher. And that kind of taught me how to like look at music and break it down into being like the, proper chord progressions and things, rather than just like riffs, and things
Right.
like that. And it kind of taught me the basics in that sense. And while I was figuring that out, it was very, it's obvious, but when afterthought, but at the point, I later realized, oh, the guitar is the same bottom 4 strings. It just has 2 more on top. And so my first foray into like jumping back into guitar was, I did have a guitar in my house, because I had it when I thought I would learn to play, but it was just too difficult. So it always just sat there. And one of my friends was kind of trying to learn how to play, and he was trying to play the guitar riff for Radiohead's Knives Out. But he was playing the rhythm incorrectly. And I was like, no, let me show you how to play it correctly. And so I picked it up, and because it was just, that's when I realized that it was much more simple. When I picked it up again after playing the bass, it was like, okay, my fingers are now know how to, play with the strings and do all that. And I was like, actually, this isn't that hard anymore. And it's like, you know what, let me try this again. And so I just kind of started picking apart songs I knew, and learned how to play guitar by sort of deconstructing the songs that I liked, and figuring out, okay, it's actually, these songs aren't that complicated. They're just going through the same chord structure, varying it up, or they're doing this and that. And you sort of learn the basics. So I would never consider myself a good guitarist or a good technical guitarist, but it kind of removed this illusion for me that these songs that you heard on the radio are these sort of untouchable, like professional things that you cannot play because you are not a professional musician. It brought it down to scope. So after that, I just sort of started jumping into a lot of things. I would teach myself piano, through not classical piano per se, but like sort of jazz chords, and figuring out chords that were used in songs to sort of play piano versions of songs that are guitar. When I was in college, I joined a band that only played Japanese rock music as a drummer, because I learned how to play drums by driving, which is extremely irresponsible. But when you're not used to sort of using each hand individually, I was like, can I do the kick drum with my left foot while I'm driving with my right foot, and use my thumbs to do like the hi-hat and snare on the wheel as I'm driving. Again, extremely irresponsible, and I don't recommend doing this. But again, kind of taught myself how to like individually control my limbs to do the sort of the stuff that drummers is second nature, right? Is the beat on the hi-hat with your right hand, and
Yeah.
snare hits and bass drum on following the bass line, things like that. And
It's interesting. I mean, are you seeing the parallel between jumping in with music and figuring it out?
Absolutely, yeah. And that there's a direct parallel, I think, to the idea of me deconstructing songs to deconstructing this sort of action genre and retrofitting it into this sort of music structure. When we were making especially the beginning of what was Hi-Fi Rush. Yeah.
So I've read quite a few articles about the kind of genesis of the game, and they all kind of focus on the same kind of three areas. And I wanted to probe a little deeper because we have more time than like a print or website interview. I've read, I had this idea and we just kind of pitched it, and really kind of truncated version of that. But I really think it's important to get to the genesis of how that idea came about and how you took all the experiences that you had in game development, and I guess music too, to move forward with this, which was obviously a passion that you had. So tell me a little bit about, like, do you remember when the seed of that happened, or where you were sitting, or how it developed like that? I can remember times when games that I've made have started, and the idea that led to the idea, to the idea, to the idea. And I'm just curious if you can go a little deeper into the genesis of that, and then we can really dive into the game.
Yeah. So it's always funny because it was something that I always had in my mind, but I'm thinking, like, when did this actually start? And I don't know. But recently our cutscene director who worked on the game, we were kind of talking about because he would be always the person I would talk to with these kind of ridiculous ideas for the games we were working on. It's like, wouldn't it be funny if we did this? We're making these evil within games. You can't really do that, but we were always just kind of make fun of our own games as we're making them. And he actually did remember when I at least verbalized the idea, which was like very early on in the original Evil Within 1. Like, he told me, I still remember, you were just walking past me in the hallway and stopped me, and you were like, what do you think about an action game where everything is like synced to the rhythm, like a music video? And he was just like, random, but that sounds cool. And then I just walked away. I didn't elaborate on it. But I do remember kind of casually, from that point, it's something we would kind of bring up, but not in the sense of we would actually do it because we didn't have an idea of how it would work. But we'd always like watch, movie trailers and sometimes even, I've mentioned it in previous interviews. There's like the filmmaker Edgar Wright does this a lot, where it's like there's a musicality to like the action scenes, sometimes literally, especially at that point. For example, in the movie Shaun of the Dead, there's like a scene that's choreographed to the theme song. But I'd always love watching these sort of, trailers for movies or trailers for games where they sync everything up to the music. It's an intentional because it feels good. But the game is nothing like that. And no one expects going in to think like, oh, it's synced to the music. But you're watching this and being like, wow, this is an awesome trailer. Like, why does this feel so good? And you kind of realize that, well, everything is just syncing with the music. And I'm also one of those people, and maybe it's a weird sort of like light ADD type situation where, if you're like I said, if you're when I'm driving in the car, I'm like tapping my thumbs on the steering wheel to the music track, or if I'm walking down the street listening to music, I kind of walk in rhythm to music. And so it's just like this kind of like kernel of an idea that was kind of slowly just like, building like a shell on top of itself, that I would bring it up and then it would just sort of expand into like funnier or more interesting ideas. But I think like the initial pitch for it, before I even made a pitch for it, actually I just wanted
it sounds like it was well baked before you got to the pitch scenario, just by that natural collaboration you have sitting next to someone or working with someone, like, hey,
yeah, and a lot of it's talking it out and riffing off something and hearing their response. And if it's kind of like a dull response, you realize, okay, maybe that's not a good idea. But I also like to think that if it's something that you keep coming back to, like there's something there,
Yep.
If you can't remember that idea you had, 5 years ago, it's a good chance that it probably wasn't that good of an idea, that even you don't remember it.
Right.
But if you keep coming back to it, there's got to be something there.
Yeah, you got to chase the ones that keep coming and tugging on your sleeve.
Yeah, and it's funny because the original like idea when I was thinking of like pitching a game actually didn't incorporate the music element, because I didn't know how to kind of do it at first. But I was like, what? I'd always love to pitch like a sort of comedy-esque like action game, like a game that didn't take itself seriously. We're just, we're working on horror games and we joke around a lot. But I was like, wouldn't it be great if we did a project that we didn't have to take it seriously? Like the game is just so ridiculous that you could just not worry about it. And then for some reason, that music idea, like I just felt like it, just having like a funny action game like wasn't enough. Like I had that idea and I was like, but it works well with that. Like music and action works very well. And you can keep everything else. It can be funny. It can have funny characters. It can be all of that. And it works because like, how are you going to explain fighting to the music? It's like, what am I going to do? Like a gritty, realistic take on, on someone who can fight to the music. And so then I just sort of merged those two ideas into one. But for a while, I was deconstructing on how it would actually work. And I was just obsessed with the idea of like, even from a game perspective, it's the opposite approach. But the way everything feels good when everything's to the music is the impact of the action hits with the music. And so the idea that I didn't actually use in the pitch, because I thought I didn't want to go too in depth and people would probably say that won't work. But in my mind, I knew it would work, or at least I believed it would work, was that it would kind of be this reverse game design where we would start from the end and work ourselves back, of thinking like the impact is where everything feels good. So how do we make it so that it syncs up so that impact feels good? But so when I thought about, I had a basic idea of how it would work. I didn't put it in documentation yet, but I made the sort of that high level pitch that you would make for pitching a game, which is the selling point, which is probably what everyone wanted at some point, which is, it's a game where everything you do automatically syncs to the music, and makes you feel like you're sort of the star of a music video that's sort of edited around you. And that's something that, putting aside the image of our studio and what Bethesda is also known for, because they're not known for these sort of games. I think that's just a natural concept that works or is appealing to people, because pretty much everyone listens to music, and they understand the idea of this sort of innate sort of energy that's in music, and combining that with an action game is also sort of weirdly common sense, or weirdly it works. But I was interesting to hear that, especially when I was pitching it. And for example, Mikami-san was in the room when we were pitching it, that he's like, I like this idea because I've heard it 1,000 times before. Like, especially working at Capcom, like people would pitch it, but everyone would realize immediately that no one knew how to do it. Like it was like this idea that people wanted to do it, and then they couldn't figure out how to actually do it in practice. But I was like, I have this idea of how it would work. That's what I was stressing. I was like, it's a good concept, and I have this idea of how it would work. And so that's how I was able to sort of convince, you know, the sort of the leads in that sense to prototype this idea and show that it's something that actually can work in this way. But this was all precedented by me being like, this is the hardest sell you'll probably ever get from anyone, because we're a studio that's only known for horror. Bethesda doesn't like I don't know if they like or don't like, but they've been known for putting out, you know, darker, grittier games, normally shooters. This is the complete opposite of everything that the company is, what our company has made before. But it's an interesting idea that I think is worth making.
This is your Jerry Maguire moment.
Yeah. And I was like,
yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't do like a sort of, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave it? Are you going to take it? Yeah. I didn't challenge them. Yeah. Yeah. I was just kind of very passionate about it. And, you know, and granted, I think if someone didn't have experience working on a project before, I could easily see that that's a good idea, but I don't know if this person can do it. I think luckily I had the experience, you know, making these games, and that if this person has an idea of how they think it would work, there's a higher chance of that happening. And I do credit my background in music for me being able to technically do this, because when we got the go ahead to do a prototype, I was able to use my knowledge of music and sort of music theory and my understanding of rhythm to explain for example, to a programmer who is not familiar with music,
right,
how this can work in programming terms. It's like explain to you like how, you know, type signatures work, how inputs would have to be received, and how we can make a system that uses our for example, like Wise, our audio system, to take music data and create a core system concept that will interpolate all the actions to the music. And it was this like sort of long documentation, you know, with nothing to go off of. And the only thing I would do is I would show them like videos of, you know, music videos of things like that, of showing how the impact is, you know, it's sort of reverse engineered in that sense. And I even did some things of taking other action games and sort of editing them to music and saying like, this is if you would speed it up, it would look like this. And, you know, kind of these almost like proof of concept videos. But even that sometimes didn't get the point across. So I was like, oh God, this is going to be really, really hard to explain to them.
So how did you tap into like the human element of, you don't have to have studied music or even pay attention to it to understand rhythm as a human, right? It's a natural element in our day-to-day life. And then, you know, like in music theory, the resolve of a 4-chord to the 1 is something that is like ingrained into everyone without having to explain how that resolution works in music theory. And it's like you're tapping into these core human elements, which is, you know, the really the underlying thing about your game. Like it's accessible to everyone because you're not over compensating game mechanics or complicating game mechanics with unnecessary kind of, you know, not to like, you know, the technical element of say Guitar Hero or things like that. Like it's really more about being a human than technically achieving, you know, that goal that's set aside. And I'm sure that when you're explaining these these ideas to programmers and you're pitching that had to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you understand music, you kind of inherently take it 2 steps too far, I think, at first. And that's something I learned. And I was actually glad that we had a programmer who did understand music, because it kind of made me understand that I need to make it so that this person sitting next to me can understand what it is. So like when you were talking about like chords resolving, it's like that is something that is not casually explained. And I was like, what is the simplest concept that for the most part people can do? And it just brought me back to, if you've ever seen like a live show, what's the one thing like that almost happens in every live show is like someone on stage will clap their hands to the rhythm and everyone in the audience claps their hands to the rhythm back. And I was like, a simple 4/4 rhythm is something that's like the sort of like baseline of that. I'm pretty sure most people can do. Like if you start clapping your hands, even someone can mimic you clapping your hands. And, you started out with these things. It's like, oh, what if we did these triplets? What if we did this like dotted quarter notes and stuff like that? We can do all this cool stuff. But that taught me to scale it back as far as possible to make it as simple as possible and accessible, because what was important is that we weren't making a rhythm game. We're making an action game that made you feel like it was a rhythm game. It seems like that's the same thing. But we didn't want to feel like when you're playing Guitar Hero, you're essentially just playing to a UI track. You're not, you're looking at notes on a screen and you're playing to those things. And we didn't want that. I wanted the technical aspect of an action game, which is you have a freedom of choice. You can put out, your music, you can put out whatever move you want at whatever time you want. And you can combo and things like that. And you're not restricted to anything. And a lot of these things focus on sort of like these framed perfect timings and very crucial like timing windows and things like that. And in some ways I was like, we can actually deconstruct what the action game has been doing. And they've been getting technically harder and harder because they've been sort of incremental. If you see a series like Devil May Cry, they've gotten more technically demanding as they've gone on because people have an expectation of how the characters should play and they want to add something new. So it creates this huge amount of depth, but for a new player to come in, it's extremely this high barrier to entry. And they've sort of solved it by sort of adding in new characters that play differently or like an easier character.
Right.
But I was like, we're aiming for that type of gameplay. But on top of that, we want people to understand or play it to the rhythm. So this is
so
like
brilliant. It's so brilliant because I don't have to tell you this, but I'm just going to say it because I love it. Anyone can play it, and whether by accident or they have that aha moment where they do sync up to the rhythm and the world and the music, it's magical.
Yeah, and that's what we were aiming for. But it's one of those things where when it's done, it's easy to look back at it in retrospect to be like, it's so obvious, it's so simple. But the iteration that involved in making it so, figuring out the sort of feedback loop of making it feel like, okay, you are pressing to the beat, or even the core concept of you don't actually even need to press to the beat to feel like you're pressing to the beat, came from us actually deconstructing the like something like Guitar Hero, because we were like, how does it work when it's playing to track and you're playing the notes, but what happens if you play like a little bit late? Essentially like not a perfect, but like a good. And we realized that they were actually
You're punished for it.
well, you're punished for it. But what's interesting is we'd actually like record it and watch videos, and we notice that what they do is they actually start playing the note, assuming that you succeeded. And then when they realize you failed, then they do that sort of like guitar clunk sound, right?
Yeah.
So they're actually tricking you in a sense by already assuming that you're playing correctly and then telling you, no, you failed. And we were like, well, what if we can get rid of that sense of like failure? It's like, what if we can actually turn your failure into a success naturally? So it's like, if you don't press it on time, don't worry, we'll sync it up for you. And all you need to do is, if the attack lands on the beat and you need to press on the beat, just press the attack button when that next attack hits. And so you get into this natural, just like you're clapping your hands to the beat, you're almost clapping, you're pressing the button as the player is hitting something, and so you kind of have that natural feedback loop. And again, very easy to say, oh, it's so simple in retrospect, but to figure that out and make comes from hundreds and hundreds of iterations, and this is not working. What do we add to it? How do we change the animation so it works? It's like these thousands of small details that create something that's essentially something that you don't want the player to realize.
But in retrospect, it is the most core important thing of the game, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's like it's the whole foundation of the game, right? Allowing anyone to play it and allowing anyone to feel powerful no matter what their skill level is. And when I was playing it, it was completely obvious to me. And it's one of those moments as a developer where you're like, I know, to me, when the ideas are good, when I'm totally jealous of what another team has done. And that was interesting because, like most of the world, I had no idea that this game existed until it came out and was announced, which was awesome. Congratulations on that. Very jealous of that part also. I've always wanted to do that, but I don't want to dive into that because it's been talked about a lot. I wrote down, I had a bullet point list of the things that just like I loved and were really interesting about the game. And I thought maybe I could read them to you. And if any jump out, we can talk about them.
Okay. Sure.
So I absolutely loved the environmental rhythm of the world. I thought that was a really important element that many games try, and I thought this one did it really well. Very, very good. The performance of the game was really great. I'm actually playing it on my Steam Deck, and it feels and looks so good. The character animation, even when you're idling in the snap, like that's just the coolest thing I've ever seen a character do. And the way it ties back into the entire game with this simple thing that again tells you kind of like everything you need to know about the game just by watching the character. It's really well done. I love that. I loved the transformation of the sling to the cape. The hero, you become the hero with that moment of flair. It was really a really powerful character connection from the humble beginning and the arc of where the character's going. Really well done. The writing and the humor, I can see what you're going for. A very specific time and vibe. I've read some stuff where you talk about it, and that really definitely resonated with me. The art style and the presentation and the fidelity of the art is mind blowing. It's like hard to almost focus on the game at sometimes because I can't believe what I'm looking at. The way the world is so playful and colorful, and the way it feels it's so well done and so woven together visually really well. And all the environmental storytelling is just A plus. I mean, it totally reminds me of, what I was thinking and seeing in my brain, on the Dreamcast and the PS2 and even up to today with, the gorillas and all the kind of cartoon things really just kind of hit home for me. The final result screen animation summaries and what happens in those screens are so fun. They're almost more fun than the boss fight sometime. I look forward to those so much. And then, all the amazing cultural references that are going on in there. It's just like, really a really complete thought overall in the world and the tone and everything that went into that. Those are the things that really stood out to me, other than the stuff that we've already talked about. But this game really surprised me. I was kind of like, I don't really know if I want to keep playing music, rhythm games. And this one is so different, and it's really powerful, really, really unexpected for me. And I really enjoyed it. So just hats off to you and the team from me anyway.
Well, first of all, thank you. A long list of interesting accolades. I'll take them one by one. I think the big things you touched on were sort of the that sort of like environment movement, chais movement, things like that. And then sort of the the writing aspect, as well as just sort of like the setting and like nostalgia feel and things like that. In terms of the environment moving, that was one of the first things we did when we were making our prototype, and we had no graphical elements to it whatsoever. But I was messing around with we made the system so things could move to the rhythm. I was learning how to use Unreal, and one of the things that I did was, I was able to sort of create basically cubes, and I made these animation curves, and to figuring out what animation curve actually matched with the feeling of like a beat. So like things that are pulsing or things like that. And I was testing it out to see what worked. And one of the first things I did was, in order to understand the rhythm, I was like, let's make it so it looks like the world is moving to the rhythm. Because that was kind of the pitch. It was like the world is moving to the music. So I made these basically just these gray spheres that would like expand up and down to the rhythm. And we're working in a gray box map. We have no artists whatsoever. So that was the only way of conveying anything visually. And what we saw is that everyone immediately gravitated to looking at that and understanding that. And this was before we even figured out that the player should also move, and there should be like a cat over your shoulder telling you the rhythm. Because one of the original things we did was we said, we're not going to put UI on the screen, because if you put UI on the screen, you're going to just follow the UI. Just like if you do Guitar Hero, or Rock Band, you don't see all that stuff that they put in the back when you're playing. You just look at the UI.
This little roadmap.
If you have that like eye thing, it's probably just in the center of the screen. And so we spent so much time saying, what can we do to do UI? And we think we have one answer. We'd be like, okay, the environment pulses, but some people wouldn't see that. And then what I tried is then doing the player's health meter will also pulse to the beat as like a reference, but that's up in the corner. And I realized that, people wouldn't see that because they wouldn't take their eyes off the character. And then we said, well, what if we put this little like almost like metronome next to the character? And that time it's just a sphere that would sort of pulse to the beat. And some people saw that, but then some people didn't even notice it was there. And then the next thing we tried when we finally got an animator on the team was making it a unique animation of the character, sort of literally like at that point it was more exaggerated, but it was essentially like almost like a metal-esque like head bang, like a very over the top animation, and made a run animation so that the run was also like every step was in beat. So we were slowly doing this, but that also taught us that people don't see rhythm in the same way. Now you're obviously a musician, and so you were talking how easy it was to grasp some of these aspects, but we also took opinions from people who don't have any musical background, and we would ask them, what did you see? And almost everyone had a different answer. Some people were like, 808 over the shoulder, I'm so glad that was there because that helped me find the rhythm. Some people thought the UI was what helped them. Some people thought the environment was what helped them. And some people, none of that helped. So we actually made the rhythm assist like button to put on the bottom. So we did actually at the end, as like a last optional effort, put UI on the screen. But we knew that some people needed that. But that taught us that it was essential that we didn't just sort of go halfway on this sort of the world is tied to the rhythm. It's like we need to make it all encompassing. And we're going to be like, this is a lot of work. But we kind of figured out, early on, like certain things would like pulse vertically, certain things would do this, and we wouldn't mix and match them because people would have a hard time. So we kind of defined these rules early, and we managed to go all out in that respect. And then there's some additional flair things that you can see in the environment that are tied to the music. But
I love
we always
those,
kind of followed those rules.
Like the pipes that kind of sub in for graphic equalizer in the walls that are everywhere.
Yeah.
Those were the things that really kept me going. I was looking for those all the time.
Yeah. So again, that's something that we would look at and we'd try to take things that come from actual music and see if we could almost implement them into the stages some of them were literal, like you'd have a screen that just turns into like an equalizer, or like you said, it's like an air conditioning unit where like things jump like a sort of, like a soundboard mixer like that. But we didn't want to.
But then all that stuff spills. All that stuff spills over, like, like the lava level and the plateaus that are moving up and down, like those moving with the music and the rhythm. It just like you just feel totally enveloped by the sense of the rhythm and the music and the song in a way that definitely haven't really felt in a game before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad to hear that worked. But again, that's another one of those like 1,000 details. So we'd make these gimmicks, and we wouldn't have a soundtrack yet. We wouldn't have sound effects. So we just have this sort of almost, if you've ever edited a video, this sort of like the beep in sound, like the sort of like the high pitched beep. Almost everything in the environment was moving with these beeps. So it would just be like almost unlistenable for a large part of development, because we need to know if they were hitting the, on the beat. Cause I was extremely, extremely critical, because you'd have a lot of people on the team, no offense to them, but they didn't have that musical background. So they thought it would match up, but you'd look at it and be like, nah, it's not really matching up. So I was like, you know what, we're going to put these beeps in, even though we sort of made our animation system. We were like, okay, 15 frames is one beat. So you're going to, every 15 frames is going to hit on like, a beat. So it has to have that point of impact there. Right. And, but we double check this by putting in these like sounds until we actually got a sound effect in. And I would go through the level every time and be like, this rock is not pulsing correctly. So it's this like insane level of detail that we would put in to every aspect, and we'd figure out how much is too much. Sometimes it was almost visual overload, so we would pull back. Sometimes it was enough, so we would add in things. But we always looked at, it was combined with, this goes into like the art aspect. We would do this with this sort of new generation cell shading that we were aiming for. We were looking at, like you said, like a Dreamcast game, but like if it was made today. They were kind of pushing the boundaries visually, and we felt like obviously games push boundaries visually, but in a more realistic way. Some do it in a cell shaded way, but they sort of do this thing where, and again, it's not all games, but it's very common for like the characters to be cell shaded, but the environment to be weirdly realistic. Or they have like outlines, but the textures are realistic. And I was like, no, this needs to look like, if you pause the game, it needs to look like it was drawn. And I don't want that illusion to be lost. And so it's a big thing from the beginning. We made 3 key art words, which was colorful, sharp, and clean, were 3 big things. And we made a key image. Yeah. And we would go through every shot of everything and say, are we hitting these things? Is it not clean? Is there too much noise in this scene? Can we not see what we want the player to see, which is the enemies? Is the floor coloring distracting from the color of the enemies, so it's hard to fight? And one thing we avoided that was actually critical, and our art team, especially our lead concept artist and art director, was constantly batting over, was anytime I would see a gradation in color, I would call it out and be like, no gradation. It has to be like a flat coloring, because I don't want this sort of illusion that we create to be like destroyed there. So I'd go over every small detail to like this insane degree, but that's how we were able to sort of nail this. I was like, it needs to be flawless. It's like, no one's going to take us seriously as a horror developer coming out with a colorful rhythm action game, unless it's like perfect and hit it out of the park from both a consumer perspective, but probably from a publisher perspective. Like I bring this up, there's like a million reasons why this game shouldn't exist or why it should be canceled at any moment. But we have to make something that's like almost impossible to say no to, because it's like essentially flawless or like perfect in that sense. So there's an obsessive amount of like sort of detail over making sure even the smallest parts of it were working to that sort of final image that we wanted.
Yeah, but you have to do that to get to that next kind of vision of creative plateau so that you can stand up and say the effort that we did on the rock and the gradation and all of those things was worth it because, like I said before, it's a very complete thought as a whole, I think. And, you got to go that extra 100 extra miles, it seems like, when you're making a game to do those things. And like you talked about with the exploration with the world moving and the UI, and like you have to explore and go down all of those alleys to make sure that you're not leaving something obvious later on the table that you don't want to. Nothing is ever complete, right? I'm sure you look at the game and go, I don't think we exactly nailed that the way I wanted to here and there. It's natural. But if you can talk about the game the way you're talking about it and the way that it was executed, that's taking game making to the next level. Some games don't go that far. And I think everyone wants to go that far, but maybe you can't for whatever reason. Like date got moved, the budget's run out, whatever it is, you don't have the right person to achieve this thing on the team. You're very, very fortunate to have been able to given the opportunity to flex, your creative vision like that. And I wonder, like, were there ever times during that where you had like crisis of faith in this? And, I don't know, because, that's natural too. That's happened to me. It's happened to anyone who's a creative. But were there ever any times during the making of this game, which I understand was 5 years?
Yeah, the prototype was like about a year, but then 4 years of like once we nailed the game concept, it was like kind of pre-pro to production. Yeah.
So what were the kind of nagging doubts that you had throughout that process that ultimately ended up being proven wrong?
I mean, I still remember the first time we kind of showed it off internally, and we got such a great response. And we had made essentially, which is the first level of the game. That was the first thing we made because we wanted people to understand the mechanics. So we knew that we had the first level had to incorporate that, and it's almost exactly the same thing that's in the final game. And it was extremely well received internally. And we had just come back from a presentation, and people were like applauding it. And I was like, now we have to make the whole rest of the game. Like it's almost like you have to, like, the realization set in. It's like, now we have to make a full experience, not just that.
The sweet and sour moment.
Yeah, like, it's like, yeah, we got it. Oh crap, now we have to make it. But I think the lingering, not just in my mind, but probably a lot of people in the team's mind, was when you're making an action game, you don't want it to feel like shallow and repetitive. And it's very easy to do that. And I'm sure we would get criticism on it, even as the final form that it released in, because it's easy to play an action game with like just one combo or one button. Mm-hmm. But just having sort of two attacks and the rhythm-based gameplay, it's like, does every fight feel the same? Does every fight feel different? And us kind of figuring out like how far can we go to stretch it out without it feeling either bloated or too complicated. And that was, there's sometimes we added stuff and it just wasn't working. We're like, oh no, we have to revert to this very simple, like, version of this game that's maybe not going to have that much depth to it. But it was then that we realized, just like, make the solid core foundation, and the depth will come later. Because we started designing around depth in the beginning. And then there was a moment where we realized, like, don't even worry about that now. It's like, once all the pieces are in place, we'll figure out where we can sort of expand on it, but just take it one piece at a time. So that was like the biggest, I think, problem. And then the other one was just, even though we scoped it, I thought, very well from the beginning, and it wasn't a big game, it was sort of, with our graphical style, it was something that we can achieve within our team size. there was still stuff like we realized these stages take a very long time to produce. You could probably do like a 3-hour podcast just about the documentation that goes into essentially reverse engineering a stage or like a boss fight around the music to make sure that everything syncs up. It's much more complicated than making a stage in any other game. So there were stages that we needed to cut because some stages were too long. And if we segue to the writing, I don't know if you've gotten to these sections, but we actually even call out when things are cut in kind of our own way.
I started seeing that. Yeah.
So we make reference to it, and we were able to get away with that because we created this world where you can play around with that stuff, and actually that helped us a lot. But I do think actually, working in this smaller box and then realizing, okay, let's cut this, let's get rid of this, actually made the experience better because, not everything can go in. And then you realize the stuff that you eventually have to cut was stuff that could have been cut. And so you just focus on the only the good stuff. So, there's stuff that could have been in there, but I think we nailed a very strong package that doesn't go on for too long. Especially nowadays, I couldn't imagine making another 30-40 hour experience. I just can't sit through them, type thing. It's like we wanted people to play through the whole thing and enjoy it. So we didn't want it to be too long, but
I'm totally with you on that. It's very hard to make and play those games for me at this stage in my career and my life. I want to be conscious of our time. I have a couple more things. I took a bunch of questions from the internet on various platforms. You may have seen a couple of them. You answered most of them. So I'm gonna ask you a couple that you didn't. They're pretty goofy. Does Hi-Fi Rush take place in an alternate version of Earth, or is it another planet entirely that just happens to have humans?
The setting is left intentionally vague. Maybe if you want to say some sort of alternate version of Earth, but there's no like countries. It's not like there's an America. There's a thing. The whole point of the game was that it felt weirdly grounded in our reality, but also didn't abide by any of our cultural rules and norms, in a sense, right? So we could have big tech companies, big companies with positions that you're aware of, but they don't have issues that also plague our world. Like they don't have sort of really like racial barriers or things like that. People speak different languages, but they don't come from different countries. It just feels like an international like world that we live in.
It's the Hi-Fi Rush world.
Yeah.
Corsica's design, outfit, choice of colors, etc., and backstory is clearly meant to distortedly mirror Chai's background, showing what will happen if he joined Vandelay and after several years passed. Were there any major changes to her character during the development? If that's even true.
Surprisingly, there were almost no character changes. The only character change that ever happened was we were supposed to have a boss for HR, which then turned into sort of a cameo HR, two HR reps from that are sort of a nod to our other games, which appear in multiple levels. But all the characters, weirdly enough, I wrote in the beginning character sheets of where they are in the beginning, where they are in the end. What are their sort of characterizations and what are they struggling with? How do they interact with these characters? And for the most part, almost nothing changed in that respect. So yeah, the Corsica character was always like that. We wanted someone who was sort of blinded by their idealization of, what this company that, or the ideal company that, people imagine. And then when they get there, it's not exactly what they expected type thing, which happens a lot for a lot of people.
It does. So many questions were about the pitch process. So many people wanted to know about that. I feel like we really talked about that kind of differently than at least than I've seen in a lot of your other interviews. The last one is, Are you aware of the guy that keeps asking you to make a 90s X-Men game in the vein of Hi-Fi Rush?
Well, I see it pop up in like Twitter that because I guess we made a stylized 2D looking game that people just expect us to immediately take on an IP that's also like a cartoon. But
This guy really wants a 90s X-Men game. I gotta say, I probably would want you guys to make one too. I know you're not going to, but it seems like that would be pretty cool.
You never expect. I like us to be a studio that you never expect what we're going to make. If you didn't, no one expected us to make this game.
Yeah.
So I think we'd like to be a place where we'd like to subvert your expectations, but surprise, but also like it's a good surprise. Not like I'm upset that they went this direction. We expected that when this game was going to come out, we get a lot of flack for it not being the Evil Within. That all the comments would be like, "Why are you making this? We want the Evil Within." But
right.
We were just blown away by the reception of people enjoying it for what it was, not for what it wasn't.
Yeah, I think you touch on a great point. It's like if you follow any great, like legendary, maybe not even legendary, but any great musical artist, they're always exploring and making something new that you're not going to expect. And I think that's probably a lot harder to do with games and established company, right? But the fact that you guys were able to do that and sounds like, hopefully continue to explore doing cool and surprising things. I think that's something our industry lacks and sorely needs. I understand why it doesn't happen. Like we talked about
It's
before,
risky,
there's risky. There's a lot on the line. It's hard to do, but kudos to you guys for doing it. Last thing. What are the top 5 games in your backlog pile right now?
In the backlog, like that I'm waiting to play?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Weirdly enough, I just picked up the most recent God of War game, so I haven't played that yet, but I'm play it. Saw Diablo came out. I want to play Diablo.
Same.
And I'm trying to. I'm literally like looking at my Xbox and PlayStation over here and looking at what I'm supposed to be playing.
Curious if something like Humanity is on that list.
Actually, I was literally playing it last night.
Good. Cool.
So I just started playing it. Of course, super dig the vibe in that game. And it just, again, it also reminds me of sort of those like a past generation feel.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I will say that for this, and it was because of this interview that the last 2 games that I played, I finally played A Plague Tale, which was on my radar for a long time, but I just never got around to it. But I was super impressed by that. And the one I played just before that, maybe you've heard of this game, Adrift.
Oh, geez.
I was like, I'm doing an interview with Adam Orth. I better play his game. So I did my research. I did my research for talking to you because what I did enjoy is the first thing you come in and the first thing you hear is the Claire de Lune. And if you play The Evil Within, that's our song as well. So it's like
I mean,
a strong connection there.
It's probably the most beautiful piece of music ever created. So,
but yeah, there's this inherent like vibe that and people latch onto that too with the Evil Within. They if you like YouTube Claire de Lune, you see people say like, "Oh, I'm here because of this game for this game," but it's so used in so much media that it's like iconic in that way, and it works in art. It worked in our game, I think, because we spun it in that the horror angle. Like it's like almost like a calming piece that we're using as almost ironic.
Yeah.
And I actually got the sense from that as well because the title screen is looking at essentially a destroyed spaceship, and look how beautiful this scene is, right? There's beauty in destruction.
Whole other podcast on that. Before we go, What's next for Hi-Fi Rush?
Well, I do know that this podcast is coming out, probably going to release after we've announced this. So we have this really cool update that includes essentially more gameplay. We wanted to see how far we can sort of push our systems mechanically. And so we made these two modes where one is called BPM Rush, which is the original game. The max BPM maxes at 160 because we thought that was like the highest level that a player that we were aiming for could probably play without being overwhelmed by how fast it goes. But internally, we were always like, man, how high can we go? And realistically, without the entire systems crumbling and the game just like crumbling apart, we were able to push it to 200 BPM, which is this like absolutely insane experience where people are always like, yeah, put a turbo mode in. And so this is essentially what it is. But it's something that even when our team was playing, we're like, this is like, is this impossible? Like, but it was one of those things that the more you practice, because you play and you constantly increase the BPM and to get to that point. Wow. And you actually get into what we were talking about before, this sort of like flow state, like this almost like Guitar Hero-esque state where you start just like going into a trance and you're able to sort of, if you're mechanically attuned to the systems, you're parrying, you're dodging at this high speed, and it just becomes this like super intense experience. But also when you like sort of get past that wave, you're just kind of like, you're almost like literally sweating.
And is the world dynamically reacting to the tempo increasing?
Yes, yeah. And we made this specific stage to this. I mean, it's not a full like level. It's like a arena-based thing, but the stage is changing also when the BPM is increasing. So more things start moving, like the walls break apart and stuff like that. But you need to, and we put new enemies in there as well. And we put all these enemies that you don't want to be put together are put there together, and you're going to be put it like against your worst opponents. But, and that's like a visceral experience. Like there's like an actual, your body will react to playing at that speed. But the other one was, we made a mode that, the whole idea was that you have to think on your feet, but the entire game is structured around like set battles and sort of set situations. Even ours, we have a post-game content called Rhythm Tower, which is sort of these set battles, 60 floors of these increasingly difficult battles. But we wanted a mode that was more randomized, so you couldn't plan ahead. So we created a mode that you start off, you lose everything. I mean, you keep all your combos that you have, but all your health upgrades, your damage outputs even like lower than at the beginning of the game. So you start out basically de-upgraded, like, level -5.
Take everything away trick.
Yeah. But after every wave, you can actually pick which aspect of the character you want to improve. And these are random, and they create either buffs or debuffs. For example, like you can have like lasers assist you to help you out while you're trying to slowly improve in these initial levels, or you can have something that says the enemies will never get stunned. You'll have to just constantly be dodging and things like that. But so we throw these sort of randomized elements with randomized enemies and all these challenges to really put you in a spot that you're, again, if you don't, you should know the systems mechanically, but it kind of puts you on the edge of your seat in that sense, and encourages you to play with more risk. Because if you want, we have a ranking system in our game. So to get like that S rank, you need a higher score. And the only way to get the highest score is to take on the more negative or challenging aspects of the game, like putting yourself in these bad positions and then not dying, coming out on top. But it's still approachable for people who are not that hardcore. Like you can sort of brute force your way through it. And you'll see it probably when it comes out, but it's a throwback to a sort of retro arcade style. Like you have literally an arcade cabinet in your hideout now that you can go and play these games, and the interface and everything is very reminiscent of these of an arcade. And there's all these nice challenges and costumes and things to unlock. But yeah, it's meaty in the sense of, for people who want a this more of that experience that we provided. It's like a spin on it, but also sort of deepens, I think, the understanding of what you need to play the game well.
Wow, that sounds really fun, really true to the game, and I'm excited to see that. I had
You
a
should
great
finish
time.
the game for us, though.
I will finish the game. There's no question. I think the having the Steam Deck is actually helping me with that.
Oh yeah,
because
it runs great and it looks great on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks great up on the TV and on the screen too. It's just good stuff. Well, thanks for doing this. I had a great time meeting you and talking to you. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope the questions were interesting enough for you. I tried to do it a little differently than stuff like I said, stuff that you kind of already talked about a lot, and I personally got a lot out of hearing you talk about it. So I really appreciate the time.
No, it was a great conversation. I love talking about actually making the games, which kind of goes, I think, underappreciated. Especially from fans. The plight.
Well,
of
that
making
is
games.
that is the point of this podcast. And also apologies for being a little froggy, but I'll get over it.
It's just feel better.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Continued success. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again.